Welcome to This Week in Morgan County. I'm your host, Russell Mokhiber. Our guest this week is John Douglas, former editor of the Morgan Messenger and author. John's written a number of books, including A Fog of Ghosts, Haunted Tales, and Odd Pieces, At the Springs with George, Washington's Adventures in the Berkeley Springs area, his first novel of a number, Shawnee Alley Fire, A Mystery of the Alleghenies, and many of his books has been translated into other languages, and Joltin' Jim McCoy's life in country music. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Russell.
You're from Cumberland, Maryland.
Yes.
What was the work of your parents, and what was it like growing up in Cumberland?
Oh, well, when I was growing up, my father was actually in Korea, and my mother worked in the 5 and 10. My grandfather, we lived with my grandfather, and he was a railroad worker. And so I grew up in a railroad neighborhood in Cumberland, but the connection to this area was that my grandfather's family had been Catlets who settled in Morgan County about 1808. And so there was always a family farm in Morgan County, in western part of the county, west of Great Capen. And we visited occasionally and came to Berkeley Springs. And so later on, I inherited part of the farm and I moved here.
When was that, when you moved here?
I moved here full-time in 1974 after visiting for a few years.
Okay. And was the messenger job your first job, or?
No, I mean, I'd been a school teacher before. And I'd also worked as a bartender and worked in stores and done all sorts of things. I started working for the Messenger in 1975, and the first thing I had to do was cover the courthouse, because the courthouse reporter had run for county commissioner, and that sort of negated him for covering the county commission. So,
do you remember who that was?
Oh, his name was Tom Davis.
Tom Davis. Did he become county commissioner?
No, he lost.
No, he lost.
It's a good lesson for reporters not to run for office.
Oh, come on.
Well, anyway, yeah, I started covering the courthouse, and I worked part-time in Hancock for the Hancock News as a general reporter, and then I covered government over here in Morgan County.
Did you, as a young man, have aspirations to be a writer? Did you come from a family of writers?
No. I came from, like I said, pretty much a working-class family. Okay. They'd all moved to Cumberland from different parts of Western Maryland and Pennsylvania and West Virginia. They all went there to work for the railroad. And so I was encouraged to read and write. And I guess I learned in elementary school that one Halloween that I could tell a ghost story, and they sent me around to all the classes to tell the ghost story. And so that way I got out of class. And I thought, that's a pretty good deal. You know, you get to go around and you get a little bit of attention from people, and you don't have to sit in class.
It was your first speaking tour?
My first speaking tour, yes. Yeah. But at some point, I was pretty much one track, history and English, and the writing evolved. I hadn't intended to be a reporter in any way. It's just that I was looking for a job in 1975, and I applied at the Morgan Messenger.
And the Messenger and the Hancock News owned by the same company?
Yes, they're owned by the Buzzard family. And my boss for many years and the publisher of the paper was Warren Buzzard. And
you were a reporter for both papers?
At first. I reported part-time for each paper. And then in the 1980s, as Berkeley Springs began growing, I became full-time at the Messenger, though I was the advisor to the Hancock News. I was their news editor. And then later on, I became editor of both papers.
And what did you like about working at the Messenger?
I guess I liked just the fact that you never knew what was going to happen, that there'd be a new story the next day. Or when I first started, I thought, it's a small town. I don't know whether interesting things will happen, but they did. And I always liked, I liked covering court. I liked sitting through trials. I liked, area controversies I actually enjoyed sometimes. And I got a little bored at times with government meetings, but that's government meetings.
One of the things I like about your writing is the historical pieces that you do and the retrospective pieces that you do. And the Messenger this week ran a piece that you had written back in the 80s about a disaster at the sand mine, an
Yes.
explosion that killed 6 miners that actually happened, I was looking at the date, if I'm right, 90 years ago tomorrow.
I think so.
Tell us about that. Give us some details on that, on what happened, and there was eventually a song that came out of it also.
Well, I guess 90 years ago, 1926, June, the sand mine at the time was called Berkeley Sand Mine. And when you're going north of town and you get to the Moose Lodge, that concrete structure there is an old tipple that they used to put sand in and then load trains with. And so that's approximately where this took place. That was Berkeley Sand Mine. At the time, there were a whole bunch of little sand mines that were later put together into the sand mine company we know now. And these guys went out one morning, and apparently they were using black powder instead of dynamite, which was a little safer. And as they were tamping it all down and ready to blow out the rock, it went off prematurely. I talked to the widow of one of the guys, actually. It would have been 55 years later, and she still remembered that morning very vividly. And as I was doing my research, I called the sand mine, and I was told that they didn't have any records of it. And so then one night, I got a call from, I guess, a lawyer at the sand mine, and his name was Robert Byers. His daughter Tina has a law office here in Berkeley Springs, and it's about 1980, early 80s. And he said, "Meet me tomorrow." And I met him someplace, and he handed me a file, and it had the inquest papers, and it had various documents about the explosion. And so I wrote about it at the time in the Morgan Messenger, and then later, a friend of mine, John Newbrawl, he was tracking a different side of it because a ballad had been written about the disaster, and he was tracking down the guy who wrote the ballad, whose name was John Unger. And so the two of us got together and did a lengthy article that was in Golden Seal magazine, I think 1993.
Golden Seal is the publication of the West Virginia Cultural
That's right.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be traditional life in West Virginia, I guess. It's mostly 20th century history, or now I guess we're getting into the 21st century, but it's not ancient history or hard history. It's people's memories.
And by the way, that structure at the Moose Lodge is still up.
Yes.
It's not very attractive. Why is it still up?
Well, I guess it's
Is it a memorial of some kind?
somebody has to pay to remove it.
Oh.
You know how that goes. If it's made of concrete, it takes some time and effort to get it down.
And that's about the area where those deaths occurred.
Oh, on the hillside above it.
And there was an inquest
Yes.
in front of jurors. I guess it
Yes.
was a grand jury.
Yes.
And
Well, it was
what-
an inquest jury, yes.
An inquest jury, and they did not charge.
They did not know what the cause was. That was their verdict. And so that was the end of it for the time.
Although the gentleman, Mr. Byers, who contacted you, as I read in the article, indicated that there was this controversy over using black
Right.
powder versus dynamite, and maybe today it would be considered reckless to do that because they stopped using it.
They
soon
stopped
thereafter.
using it soon after, yes. Yes, I mean, I was indebted to him for wherever he found that file with the inquest, and he had obviously asked various people in the sand mine industry about it because he was the one who told me that it was black powder as well.
What about your interest in history? Because you've written historical books, historical novels. How did that come about?
I guess I was always interested in history. When I was a kid in Cumberland, we had our little bookshelf libraries in each classroom, and I used to read all those little books like Young George Washington, Young Tom Jefferson, all that stuff. And I was always sort of interested in history, and so like the George Washington book came about simply because I was tired of hearing people with various myths about Washington and Berkeley Springs. And also I learned that my own family, who, as I mentioned, the Catlett family before, in my research, I learned that they had actually sold the land in Eastern Virginia to Washington's grandfather that, back in the 1650s, and then later they bought Washington's land here in Morgan County, and so the family farm that I was aware of and grew up around a little bit was actually land that Washington had owned, and so that gave me a little personal slant to it, and then I just found it interesting.
Now, this book is about some of the myths. What is a myth that stands out for you?
I think one of the common ones that people often say is that Washington discovered Berkeley Springs, which he didn't do. He was 16 years old and a surveyor's assistant, and he came here because the Potomac River was swollen from spring floods, and they couldn't get across, so to kill the day, they came back to Berkeley Springs. They were trying to go west, and in those days, the best road west was roughly where the towpath is. On the Maryland side. And then other people think that he designed the town or had something to do with laying out the town. He didn't. He was at the Revolution. There's a multitude of myths in Washington around here.
So he wasn't present at the creation?
He was preparing to cross the Delaware.
At the creation?
Yes, yes.
What about the bathtub?
Well, the bathtub is probably, it's a reasonable story. I mean, you know, he would have no doubt taken a bath someplace along there, and whether it was that exact spot, who knows.
Okay. Now, you're also a novelist.
Yes.
This is your first, Shawnee
Yes.
Alley
Shawnee
Fire,
Alley Fire.
Mystery of the Alleghenies. What is it about?
It's about the 1982 recession, and back in the 80s, I was interested in writing mystery novels, so I wrote a few, and that was published by St. Martin's Press, and it got great reviews, and it was published in Germany and Italy and France. Some of those books are the foreign editions, Argentina, Spain, a bunch of places, and got a Europe trip out of it one time from one of the publishers. It's about a photographer who moves back to his hometown called Shawnee, which is basically the Cumberland of my memory. And there's a fire in the alley behind him, and an old man gets burned up, and so the mystery begins there. But it has a lot of pictures of the early 80s recession, food banks, people standing in line, and a train wreck, things that I'd covered as a reporter. The train wreck descriptions probably came straight out of train wrecks that I'd covered as a reporter.
Do you believe in ghosts?
No.
This book.
Other than the ones we make in our own head.
Okay, you don't believe in ghosts, but you're interested in ghosts.
I like ghost stories. I like
ghost
stories.
stories.
Yeah.
And that was your first speaking tour?
Yeah, my father used to tell ghost stories around the campfire.
Isn't there a famous Hancock story, ghost story, that's in here? No. Okay, what am I thinking about the Hancock? Oh, I know what I'm thinking about. There's like a homicide case.
Oh, the redhead murder.
And that's one of those historical
Yes.
pieces that I read. Tell us about that.
Well, boy, you're putting me on the spot with dates. I guess it was around 1950. There was a body found right this side of the Hancock Bridge. If you came over the Hancock Bridge toward Berkeley Springs and took the road up the hill, that would have been the old US 522. And up on the hillside there, there was the body of a nude redhead was found. And of course they didn't know who she was. And they did everything in their power. I mean, everybody in town, I think, saw her body at the funeral home. People have told me that they remembered standing in line to see the body to try to identify the woman. And nobody ever knew who she was, so when you don't know who the victim is, it's hard to figure out who did it. Back about 1990, a former state trooper here, Don Sharp, later a magistrate, told me that this is a great story I should look into, and he sort of opened the door for me to get the state police report from the time and all the photos and things. And we had this idea we were going to get it on Unsolved Mysteries, the TV show, but that never happened. But I wrote it for the paper, and then I wrote it for a magazine. I turned it into a piece of fiction that was published first in France after one of my mystery novels was published there, and then it was later published in actually an Arts Council book, one of those Tales from the Springs books, and it's also in A Fog of Ghosts.
Oh, it's not a book; it's an article.
It's a lengthy article.
Okay.
It's the centerpiece of that book. After the ghost stories, you
did
get
they
that.
ever? There's some recent reporting on it, on who the redhead was. Did they ever figure out who she was?
Well, one day at the Messenger, there was for a while, the West Virginia State Police had a cold case reporter. And one day he showed up at the Messenger because somebody had told him about this. And so he and I went off together and looked at some of the sites and stuff. And he also gave me his information. And so he became convinced that these people had contacted the state police looking for their grandmother, who hadn't been heard of since the late 40s. And so he became convinced that that was her. And I didn't do it, he talked the judge into exhuming the body. And so I was there when they dug the body up and from Greenway Cemetery here in Berkeley Springs. And
when did they do that?
oh, it would have been late 90s, I think. And it wasn't her. They did a DNA test, it wasn't her. But now they have the DNA, so if anybody should come forth and say, nobody's seen Grandma since 1949, then maybe they can match up the DNA.
There was also a public lynching in Berkeley Springs.
Yes.
And you wrote about that.
Yes.
Tell us.
The man lynched it was the 1870s, and the man lynched was Samuel Crawford. He called himself a doctor. He was sort of a medicine show guy. He sold patent medicines, and he was a well-known horse thief and also well-known for deflowering young maidens. And so I guess that at some point one of his patients died, and it appeared to be suicide. And so he'd managed to slip away from all his other crimes, but he ended up in jail, in the local jail here, which would have been roughly where the courthouse is, I guess. And he ended up there, and people decided that they weren't going to wait. And so they took him out one night, and they hung him from a tree down about, not too far from Earth Dog. They took him down the street, and turned out when the test results came back, he hadn't poisoned the guy at all.
Is that tree still there? Do we know?
I don't know. I mean, I can't. In the book, there's a picture of the lynching, but identifying a tree is difficult because there's no buildings to give you perspective or anything.
What, during your time, so those are some historic examples. During your time in reporting from Morgan County, what were some of the stories that stand out in your mind?
I think the recurring story that just really hits you if you're a reporter in this region are just floods. I covered many floods. Like the 1985 flood was a major one that washed away a trailer court in Paw Paw and did lots of damage all along the Potomac and Capon. The 1996 flood, I guess it was, there were two that year, and they both were very similar to the 1985 flood. The only saving grace was that some of the things from 1985 hadn't been rebuilt. And just covering floods, because you see the human tragedy, and you see what nature can do, that nature's not this kind, benevolent spirit that a lot of people like to pretend she is. And I was always moved by that. My book Haunts, which is here someplace, this one, this is inspired by one of the floods. After an Appalachian flood, bones are exposed, and so we have to get back in time to figure out who these bones belong to and who might have done it, and it also takes place in my fictional city of Shawnee,
which is the Cumberland of your youth.
Yeah, and then of course when your murder trials are, as I said, I like covering trials, and murder trials and the like are interesting things, even if they're gruesome.
What about, it seems like you've shied away from politics in the region, that you like more the human stories, the direct human stories. Why do you think that is?
I guess that I determined early on, I mean, of course I covered politics and I wrote editorials for, even before I was editor, I wrote most of the editorials. But I think people who hang their hopes on politics are bound to be disappointed. I've never seen a great deal of bravery out of politicians or anything, and I found that the culture of the area and those events like the floods and you know, the songs that arose from a sand mine disaster, I find all that a lot more interesting than a boring politician. I mean, most of their speeches I fall asleep on.
What about the population in the region, the from heres and the come heres thing?
I don't know, I was sort of straddling that because of my own family history, but I saw it, I see it. I think that used to be called the insider-outsider back in the 80s. And it just recurs now and then. You know, you have periods that usually when things are going great for the town, nobody brings it up much, and then when things get rough, somebody gets mouthy about, well, you know, we could do without all those newcomers or something like that. But
Or it used to be better before they came in. I mean, we hear that too.
I hear that too. It was different. It was different. I don't know that it was better. You certainly, you know, if you want to go out to dinner, you now have a choice of restaurants. You have a different artistic and cultural life. But there are things to be said for the old times. I mean, one of the first stories I did back in the 70s was a blacksmith in Great Capon. And he was retired from the sand mine where for years the sand mine used to, maybe they still do and I don't notice it, but they used to have this little engine out front, this little train out front. He made that. I did a story about the blacksmith, and you know, things like that are gone. I mean, those guys are gone, and they were interesting, and they were sort of the kind of people I remember growing up around, and so it's different. It's different. It was much more. I guess Berkeley Springs was much more like a lot of West Virginia or Appalachian region, and then we had an influx of retirees and people of various ages for various reasons.
Mm-hmm. We have just a couple more minutes. You also have an affinity for music. You wrote a book about Jim McCoy and the Troubadour and that whole music scene. You organize music events. So tell us, what are you? Do you play music?
I'm a very bad drummer.
And what's your interest in music and doing?
I don't know. It just happened. I mean, it just happened as a kid. I always loved music, and back in the 90s, I was a contributing editor to a magazine called Blues Access, which was a blues magazine. And then one day I decided that I'd heard enough blues and stopped working for that one.
What music do you like now? What kinds of music do you like now?
Me, I mostly listen to jazz.
But you like folk.
I like everything, and the shows I put on that you mentioned, you know, over for the Hancock Arts Council actually. Yeah. I've done a show on Woody Guthrie, one on Hank Williams, a couple on folk music of the '60s. I'm working on one now that's like Sam Phillips and Son Records 50s music. And when the Morgan Arts Council did their Roots Music Year, what's that, 8-10 years ago, I was one of the coordinators of that. I put on the concerts and things. It's always fascinated me. I mean, you know, I think it says a lot about the culture of a place and And the songs, just like the ballad about the sand mine disaster, the songs convey things about the history and attitudes of a region.
All right, just finally, what's your next music thing, and what's your next book?
Well, aside from the Hancock show, I'm working on a benefit for the Morgan County Public Library this fall, and it's going to be called a Morgan County Evening. We're going to try to do songs that have to do somehow with Morgan County or West Virginia, and I'm also trying to get a better start on a new novel that takes place in Western Maryland in the early 20th century and involves land development at what is now Green Ridge State Forest.
All right. Well, John Douglas, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for watching This Week in Morgan County.